The bell above the door made a small sound when she walked in. She had carried that ring in her coat pocket for 3 days before she walked in. You know that moment when you have already made a decision you know might cost you something you can never get back, but you have no other choice? That was her, walking through that door. Presley set the ring on the glass counter. She did not explain it. She did not look away from it either. She looked straight at it. A thin gold band, simple setting, a small pale stone that had long since gone cloudy at the edges. It had sat in her mother's jewelry box for 30 years. It had sat in Presley's own dresser drawer for the 6 years since her mother died. She had not worn it. She had not been able to bring herself to sell it either, until this morning. Until the heating bill came, and the number on it was the same number she did not have. The man behind the counter picked it up. He was mid-40s, solid through the shoulders, unhurried in his movements. His name was Trent Harmon. He had owned this shop on West 3rd Street for 11 years. Before that, he had spent 16 years as a working jeweler. And before that, he had apprenticed under a man in Columbus who taught him that every piece of metalwork carried the fingerprint of the person who made it, if you knew where to look. He turned the ring under the light. He checked the stone. He checked the setting. He checked the band for marks. Then he stopped moving. On the inside curve of the band, just left of center, was a small stamped impression. A maker's mark. His maker's mark. The one he had used for the first 4 years of his career, before he updated the design. The one that appeared on exactly 23 pieces he had made between 1999 and 2003. He knew this ring. He remembered this ring. He looked up slowly at the woman on the other side of the counter. She was watching him with level eyes. Dark circles. A coat with a broken zipper. She had safety pinned, shut at the collar. She had already made the hard decision before she walked in. She was simply waiting for it to be over. He looked back down at the ring. He could have said something. He knew, in the space of that moment, that there was something here larger than a Tuesday transaction. He could feel the shape of it the way you feel weather changing before it arrives. He set the ring on the counter. He counted out $11 and slid them across the glass. She reached for the money. Her thumb passed once over the safety pin at her collar, a small unconscious movement before she folded the bills and put them in her pocket without counting them. She said thank you. She walked back out through the door, and the bell made its small sound again, and she was gone. Trent stood at the counter for a long time after that. The shop was empty. The heat ticked in the vents. Outside, the February sky over Ohio sat flat and colorless above the rooftops. He held the ring in his palm. He thought about a woman who had come into his shop 22 years ago with $60 and an errand she was running for someone else. He thought about the face of the woman who had just left, and he thought about how much her daughter did not know. She did not know she had just sold the key to everything her mother died trying to leave her. Stay with me, because what Trent did over the next 3 months and what he placed inside a box and carried to her door did not just return something Presley had lost. It returned something she never knew she had. And what she found at the bottom of that box, a single piece of paper with a number written on it, was going to change the shape of every year that had come before it. Presley Adair was 37 years old. She had grown up in a small house on the east side of Dayton, Ohio, where the sidewalks buckle in winter and the corner store has been the same corner store for 40 years. Her mother, Cassidy, had taught 4th grade at Elm Creek Elementary for 23 years. She drove the same car for 11 of them. She packed her lunch every single day in the same blue bag. She wore her good coat only to church and parent conferences. She was not a woman who spent money on herself. She moved through the world carefully, as if she understood that what you kept was always more important than what you showed. Presley grew up watching her mother do the math at the kitchen table every Sunday night. Electric, gas, groceries, insurance, car. The way she moved the numbers around until they settled into something manageable. The way she never used the word tight, even when it was. Cassidy had one piece of jewelry, the ring. She had bought it herself, though Presley would not understand the full circumstances of that until much later. Presley was 17 when she got a part-time job at a small administrative office. The man who ran it was 43, married, and spoke in the careful language of someone who understood how to be charming without appearing to try. He told her she was sharp. He said she had instincts most people twice her age did not have. She was 19 when she found out she was pregnant. She told him in his office with the door closed. He looked at her, not cold exactly. Arranged. The expression of a man reaching for a response he had prepared for a moment he had always known might come. He said the pregnancy was not something he could be associated with. He said he trusted she would handle it quietly. She left his office. She did not go back. She told her mother that night. Cassidy sat across from her at the kitchen table and did not say a single word about what had been lost, or who was to blame, or what it meant for the plans they had made together. She reached across the table and took both of Presley's hands in hers. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "We will figure this out. Not I. We." That was Cassidy. Willa was born on a Wednesday in April, small and loud, with her grandmother's forehead and her mother's eyes. Cassidy was in the delivery room. She cut the cord. She held that baby for 20 minutes while Presley slept, and she talked to her in a low voice about everything they were going to do together. She died 4 years later. A stroke, fast and without warning, on a Saturday morning in March while she was making coffee. She was 57 years old. She had 23 years of fourth graders who still remembered her name. She had a daughter, a granddaughter, and a sister named Tessa, who had always lived 40 minutes away in Columbus and who came down for the funeral with a casserole and stayed for the week. Tessa was the only family they had left. She was warm about it. She called every Sunday. She appeared at Willa's birthday parties with the right gifts and at Presley's lowest moments with the right words. She sat at Presley's kitchen table over the years and listened to every hard thing, patted her hand, and leaned in with a voice full of comfort. "Your mother would have wanted you to be strong." Presley believed her. "You believe the people who show up. You believe the people who sit at your table. You believe the people who are warm enough, consistent enough, and present enough that doubt never finds a foothold." She had been given no reason to question Tessa. Not yet. After her mother died, Presley raised Willa on 2 jobs and the discipline she had learned watching her mother at the kitchen table every Sunday night. She worked days at a medical records office on Salem Avenue. She worked 2 evenings a week cleaning offices downtown. She learned the bus routes in a city that punished the people who needed them most. She learned which grocery store restocked the markdown rack on Thursday mornings, and that if you arrived after 7, the bread was already gone. She learned which utility company gave the longest grace period before cutting service, and she applied the same attention to surviving that her mother had applied to teaching, without complaint, without theater, without waiting for anyone to notice. She kept a jar on the kitchen counter. She filled it slowly, a few dollars at a time, and never touched it unless she absolutely had to. She touched it more often than she wanted to. Some months the jar and the math and the 2 jobs were enough. Other months she would sit at the table on a Sunday night and move the numbers around looking for a combination that worked, and sometimes finding one, and sometimes not. Willa grew up knowing they did not have much. She did not treat it as a wound. She helped where she could. Tips from the diner saved in an envelope, errands run without being asked. Dinner started before Presley got home from the second shift. She had her grandmother's forehead and her mother's eyes. She had also, without anyone teaching it to her, learned the quiet language of a household that ran on discipline and love in equal measure. Now Willa was 18. Serious, clear-eyed. She asked real questions and waited for real answers. She had been accepted to a community college program in medical assisting. The acceptance letter was on the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like the state of Ohio that Cassidy had bought on a road trip 15 years ago. The enrollment deposit was due in 6 weeks. Presley knew the number. She had been moving it around in her head for 2 months, the way her mother used to work numbers on Sunday nights. She had not told Willa how close the edge was. She was managing it the way she managed everything. Alone, quietly, keeping her face level, buying time. What she did not know, what she had not been told, was that Willa had already made her own decision. 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday evening, while Presley was on her second shift downtown, Willa had sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and submitted a deferral request to the college. 1 year. She had told herself she would work full-time, save everything she could, help her mother get steady, and go the following fall. The confirmation letter was in her bag, not on the refrigerator. She had not said a word about it. Two women in the same house, both carrying the same weight, both protecting the other from the full truth of what they were prepared to give up. Neither of them knowing the other had already made the silent sacrifice. It was on a Sunday, for days before the heating bill arrived, that Tessa called. Her voice was warm. It was always warm. She asked about Willa, about the college start, about whether Presley was eating enough. Then her voice softened further, settling into the register she always used for the closing line. You know I'm always here if you need anything, baby. Presley thanked her and said they were managing. Tessa held the warmth a beat longer before she said goodbye. Your mother would have been so proud of you both. And Presley held the phone after the line went quiet and felt the familiar weight of that sentence settle over her like a coat. She did not know that 40 minutes away in Columbus, Tessa's phone was sitting next to a brokerage app, and that 3 days earlier, a quarterly dividend notification had arrived in her account. The same account it had been arriving in every 3 months for the past 13 years. She went to bed that Sunday night and added up the same numbers. They came out short. They always did. For days later, she safety pinned her coat and put the ring in her pocket and took the bus to Trent's shop on West 3rd Street. She walked home with $11, the heating bill paid, and the ring now gone. She made dinner. Willa came in from her shift at the diner and set her tips on the counter, and they ate together without talking much. Outside the kitchen window, February pressed against the glass. Trent did not sleep well that night. He sat at his workbench after closing and held the ring under his lamp. He thought about the woman who had commissioned it 22 years ago, $60 on the counter, notebook paper with precise handwriting, a ring for a neighbor she barely knew. He had made it. He had undercharged her. He had put his maker's mark on it because he was proud of the work. He was 23 years old then. He had not yet known what kind of jeweler he would become, or whether the work would amount to anything. He had just been a young man trying to make something right out of the materials in front of him. She had been the same. Now her daughter had sold it for $11 to pay a heating bill. He started making moves the next morning. He found Cassidy's name through the county property records attached to her last known address. From there, he found she had taught at Elm Creek Elementary for 23 years. Through a mutual contact, he tracked down a retired colleague named Ruth Hensley, who had eaten lunch with Cassidy every Friday for 12 of those years, now living outside Yellow Springs. He drove out to see her on a Saturday. Ruth Hensley was 71. She poured coffee without asking if he wanted it. She did not waste time. She had spent decades in classrooms and had no patience left for anything indirect. He explained what he knew. She listened without interrupting. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at the window for a moment before she spoke. Cassidy talked about Presley the way most people talk about the only thing they ever did that really mattered. She told him everything. Cassidy had been quietly buying shares in a regional Ohio manufacturing company called Harwood Industrial for nearly 2 decades, steadily, from the year Presley was born until the year she died. $100 a month when she could. More in good years. She had opened the account when Presley was born and added her sister Tessa as joint owner because she had no one else to put on the paperwork and she needed someone on the account in case something happened to her. She had also written a clause into her will. Ruth folded her hands on the table. Cassidy had told her about the clause over lunch, that within 2 years of her death, Tessa was to transfer Cassidy's full share of the account value to Presley outright. She had it drawn up by a lawyer. She mentioned it to Ruth with the ease of a woman who had finished building something and was finally setting it down. Cassidy died 14 years ago. The transfer should have happened 12 years ago. Presley was now 37. Trent sat at Ruth Hensley's kitchen table and forgot to breathe. He kept his voice level when he asked it. Do you know if Presley ever received the transfer? Ruth looked at him. Something moved across her face, not surprise exactly. She had just understood the shape of something she had assumed was handled long ago. She unfolded her hands and pressed them flat on the table. I never thought to ask, she said quietly. I assumed Tessa took care of it. Trent drove back to Dayton. He engaged a paralegal service to pull the public records. Cassidy's will was on file with Montgomery County Probate Court. The clause directing Tessa to transfer Cassidy's share value to Presley within 2 years of her death was there in full. He pulled Harwood Industrial's public dividend schedule next. Quarterly payments, uninterrupted for 16 years. Based on the payment calendar, those dividends had been going to Tessa as the surviving joint owner every 3 months for 14 years. He found the February payment date. The amount was $1,140. He sat back. That payment had cleared 9 days before Presley walked into his shop and sold her mother's ring for $11 to pay a heating bill. He sat with that for a long time. Then he went to work on the box. He spent 3 weeks assembling it, carefully, unhurried, the way he approached any work that mattered. He went back through his commission records from 1999 to 2003 and found the entry. $60, a pale stone in a plain gold band, a customer who had left only a first name and an address on Fenway Street. He tracked down 3 more people Cassidy had touched over the years. A woman whose family she had helped quietly one winter when the father was laid off. A former student now in his 30s who wrote to him in 2 careful paragraphs about a teacher who stayed late to make sure he understood fractions before the state exam when no one else had. And the daughter of the retired music teacher who still had the photograph from her mother's last months. That conversation with the music teacher's daughter lasted an hour. She told him that her mother had worn the ring every day in the final weeks of her life. She told him that when her mother passed, she had driven to Cassidy's house herself and put the ring in Cassidy's hand. She said her mother had asked her to do it, that the ring belonged with the woman who had understood what it meant to give something beautiful to someone running out of time to receive it. He wrote each account down in a small brown notebook by hand. He had the financial documents printed and organized. He put everything in order. The original commission entry, the share records, the will clause, the dividend payment schedule. He put the February payment date on the last page where it could not be missed. He put the ring on top, wrapped in a square of clean cloth. He tied the box with a piece of cord. He did not add a letter. He had thought about it and decided against it. Everything that needed to be said was already inside. If you are watching this right now, stop for just a moment and answer something honestly. Has someone ever built something for you in silence, made a decision on your behalf before you even knew you needed it, and you only understood it long after they were gone? Drop your answer in the comments below. Tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. We read every single one. And if you are not yet subscribed, do it right now, because what happens when Presley opens that box is something you will not want to miss. 3 months after he bought the ring, Trent drove to Presley Street on a Saturday morning in May. He had driven past the block twice before he parked, not because he doubted what he was doing, but because he understood that once he knocked on that door, the shape of her life would change permanently. She had not asked for that. She had come into his shop on a Tuesday morning with a safety pin coat and $11 worth of need, and she had not asked for any of what he was about to bring to her door. He parked. He sat for a moment with the box on the passenger seat, brown, plain, tied with a piece of cord. Not heavy. The heaviest things rarely are. Then he got out and walked to the door and knocked. Willa answered. She looked him over once, measuring him the way she had learned to measure anyone who came to that door. "Can I help you?" Trent kept his voice even and unhurried. "My name is Trent Harmon. I own a shop on West 3rd Street. I think your mother came in a few months ago." Willa looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and turned toward the hallway. "Mom." Presley came from the kitchen with a dish towel in her hand. She saw him, and something changed in the way she looked at him. Not recognition. Not quite. But she had sensed, before he said a word, that something was about to change the shape of the room. He held out the box. "I think you should have this." His voice was quiet, settled. "All of it, not just the ring." She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she stepped aside to let him in. Willa stood near the counter. Trent pushed the box across to Presley and said nothing else. He had spent 3 months deciding how much to explain before she opened it, and he had concluded that the box should speak first. She untied the cord slowly. She lifted the lid. The ring was on top, wrapped in a small square of cloth. She picked it up and held it, and she did not say anything for a moment. She looked at it the way you look at something you had convinced yourself you had let go of and understand now that you had not. Beneath the ring was a small brown notebook, soft-covered, filled with Trent's handwriting. She opened it and read the first entry. He had written down everything Ruth Hensley told him. Everything the other 3 people he had found told him. The woman whose family Cassidy had helped that winter, the former student and his fractions, the man at the hardware store on Germantown Street who said Cassidy had quietly paid the account of the family 2 doors down for 4 months and asked him to say nothing about it to anyone. And the music teacher's daughter. He had written down everything she said, about the ring worn every day in the final weeks, about the drive to Cassidy's house after the funeral, about her mother's instruction to return it to the woman who had understood what it meant to give something beautiful to someone running out of time to receive it. Presley turned the pages slowly. She did not rush. Near the back of the notebook was a photograph, small, printed on plain paper. In it, a woman Presley did not recognize, elderly, thin, propped up in a chair by a window, was holding something small in both hands and looking at it with an expression that had no name. Beside her, standing with her coat still on as if she had just arrived, was Cassidy. She was smiling. Presley placed her hand flat on her mother's face in the photograph. She sat with it. She let it arrive. Then she reached back into the box. The last thing was an envelope. Inside it, 2 documents. The first was a copy of the will clause from the probate record, directing Tessa to transfer Cassidy's full share value to Presley within 2 years of Cassidy's death. Presley read it once. She read the will clause twice. She turned to the second document. The Harwood Industrial Dividend Payment Schedule. 14 years of quarterly payments. The projected total at the bottom of the last column. She read the number. She set the paper down on the table. She picked it up and read it again. Her eyes moved back up the column, slowly, until they found the February entry. The payment date. The amount. $1,140. 9 days before she had sold the ring. She thought about that Tuesday morning. The heating bill on the counter. The ring in her coat pocket. The bus ride across town. $11 slid across a glass counter. $1,140 9 days before that. She set the paper down carefully. Her hands were not entirely steady. She needed them to be. Willa had moved from the counter without Presley noticing. She was standing beside her now, looking at the paper. "Mom." Presley did not answer. She was looking at Cassidy's coffee mug on the shelf above the kitchen window, the one she had kept there for 6 years, the one thing she could not put away. She reached up slowly and wrapped both hands around it. It had long gone cold. It was always cold now. But she held it, and she took one breath, and the breath broke in the middle. Just once, quietly, with no performance in it. Then she set the mug back on the shelf, carefully, exactly where it belonged, and she straightened. She looked at Willa first, then at the mug, then at the ring still on the cloth square on the table. She looked across the table at Trent. Her voice was steady when it came. "She never told me any of it. The shares, the $60, the will clause, not one word." Trent looked at her directly. "No." She put her palms flat on the table. "But she built all of it." Her voice dropped quieter, working harder than it looked. "She built all of it. And I can't tell her I know." The kitchen was very quiet. Nobody moved. Outside, the morning breeze moved through the street, ordinary, unhurried, indifferent to what was happening at the table. A neighbor's door. A car pulling out. All the small, unremarkable sounds of a Saturday going about its business. Inside, something had changed. The following Thursday, Presley drove to Columbus. She had not called ahead. Tessa answered the door in a house coat, surprised, then warm, the warmth arriving right on schedule. She pushed the door wider and stepped back. Come in, come in. I'll put the kettle on." Presley came in. She did not take off her coat. Tessa talked while she filled the kettle. She asked about Willa, about the fall college start, about whether Presley was eating enough. All the questions of a woman performing the role of family in the language she had used for 12 years. Presley waited until she sat down. Then she took the folded document from her coat pocket, and put it on the table between them. Tessa looked at it. She did not touch it. Presley kept her voice level and her hands still. I know about the shares. The kitchen was quiet. I know about the will clause. Presley did not look away from her. I know what my mother wrote. I know that you received notification from the probate lawyer. I know that the transfer was due 12 years ago. She opened the document to the dividend schedule. She turned it so Tessa could read it. Then she placed her finger on the February entry and held it there. That payment cleared 9 days before I sold her ring. Presley's voice did not rise. It did not need to. I took the bus across town in the cold and sold my mother's ring for $11 to pay a heating bill. 9 days after that money cleared your account. Tessa's hands were folded on the table. Her face had not broken, but something behind it had. She had run out of composure and was sitting inside the remains of it. I was going to tell you. Her voice reached for steadiness and almost found it. I was waiting for the right time. You had so much going on and I didn't want to overwhelm you. I thought when things settled down. Presley let the words land and dissolve. Then she said just 2 of them back. Settled down. Not a question. Just the words. Return to the room they had been spoken in. Tessa looked at the table. Then she looked up. And in her face was the thing that had been sitting underneath all the Sunday calls and the kitchen table visits and the hand patting for 12 years, the thing that had never quite been named. Her voice had shifted when she spoke, quieter now, stripped of the warmth. Cassidy always made me feel small. Everything she did was so righteous, so correct. For once, something came to me first. For once, I was the one who had something she didn't leave instructions for. She stopped. I told myself I'd transfer it eventually. I told myself you weren't ready. The kitchen was silent. Presley looked at her aunt for a long moment. Then she spoke quietly. Some people don't steal money. They steal the years that money was supposed to save. Tessa said nothing. Presley leaned forward slightly. You sat at my table. You held my hand and told me she would have wanted me to be strong, while you were cashing her investment every 3 months. The strength she wanted me to have, she already paid for it. She built it herself, dollar by dollar, on a teacher's salary for nearly 2 decades. She named me in the paperwork. She trusted you to hand it to me. She stood up. She folded the document and put it back in her pocket. Tessa's mouth opened. 2 syllables started, something that might have been I'm sorry, and then stopped. She looked at the table instead. It was the most honest thing she had done in 12 years. It was not enough. She looked at Tessa one last time, not with heat, not with the rawness of something that had just broken open, but with the eyes of a woman who had finally seen something completely and would not look away from it again. I'll have a lawyer contact you. She picked up her bag from the back of the chair. I'd like you to cooperate. She walked out through the hallway and out through the front door and down the drive to her car. She sat in the car for a while. The Columbus morning was mild, the trees on Tessa's street filling in, pale green and new, indifferent to the 12 years they had witnessed from that driveway. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. Not the grief of it. Not the anger. Something quieter and more complete than either of those. The feeling of a thing that had been wrong for a very long time, finally being named in the right room by the right person. She started the car and drove home. The transfer took 4 months to complete. Tessa's own lawyer reviewed the documentation within the first week and told her plainly that the legal position was unambiguous, that contesting it would only expose her to additional liability for the dividend payments she had collected over 14 years. She cooperated. The paperwork moved through the proper channels without drama, the way things move when the documentation is clean, and the outcome was never really in doubt. Trent came back the following Saturday to see if Presley needed anything. Then the Saturday after that. At some point over those 4 months, neither of them noted exactly when he had stopped arriving as a visitor and started arriving as something else. The morning the transfer confirmed, Presley sat at the dining table with her phone in her hand. Willa came in from the other room and sat beside her. She looked at her mother's face and read it, carefully, without rushing to fill it. She reached into her bag before she spoke. She put the deferral confirmation letter on the table between them and kept her hand on it a moment before she let go. Mom, there's something I need to tell you. Presley looked at the letter. She looked at the date it was submitted. She looked at her daughter's face. Willa. Willa held her ground. I didn't want you to carry it alone anymore. Her voice was steady, quieter than usual, the voice of someone saying out loud what they had rehearsed alone. I was going to work for a year and go the following fall. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd say no. Presley looked at her daughter for a long time, at the forehead that belonged to Cassidy, at the eyes that belonged to no one but herself. She thought about a woman packing her lunch every morning and doing the math every Sunday night and spending her last $60 on a ring for a stranger. She thought about nearly 2 decades of $100 share purchases, quiet, disciplined, without ceremony, and a will clause written in a lawyer's careful typeface, and a promise that never got kept. She thought about Willa sitting at this table alone on a Tuesday evening, submitting a deferral request, and putting the letter in her bag, and saying nothing. The silence ran in the blood. The love ran in the blood. She reached across the table and took both of Willa's hands in hers. You are going in the fall. Presley held her daughter's eyes. The original fall. There is still time to reinstate the enrollment. We are going to call the admissions office on Monday. Willa searched her mother's face. Mom. Presley squeezed her hands once. She already paid for it. Your grandmother already paid for it. It just took a while to arrive. Willa looked at the phone on the table, at the numbers still on the screen. She looked at her mother's face. She looked at Cassidy's coffee mug on the shelf above the window. And then, slowly, she nodded. Trent was sitting across the table. He looked at Presley. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She looked at him, and something passed between them in the quiet of that kitchen that did not need language. Later, after Willa had gone to her room and the evening had settled over the street outside, Presley stood at the kitchen window alone. She reached up and wrapped her hands around Cassidy's coffee mug, the way she had held it that morning when her breath broke in the middle. This time she did not break. She just held it, steady. She spoke quietly into the empty kitchen, to the mug, to the room, to the woman who had packed her lunch every day and moved numbers around on Sunday nights and built something extraordinary out of ordinary discipline. I know what you did, and I know why you didn't tell me. She set the mug back exactly where it had always been. She stood at the window and looked out at the May evening, the Ohio street going quiet in the dark, the neighbor's porch light coming on, the ordinary world continuing in all its ordinary ways. And for the first time in a very long time, she breathed without counting the cost of it. Cassidy Adair taught 4th grade for 23 years. She drove the same car for 11 of them. She packed her lunch every single day. She moved numbers around on Sunday nights with focus and discipline, understanding that the things worth having were the things you built slowly, and that what you built slowly could outlast almost anything. She spent $60 on a ring for a woman she barely knew. She spent nearly 2 decades buying shares $100 at a time. She wrote a will clause and trusted the wrong person to honor it, and died before she could know whether any of it had made it through. It made it through. Not on the schedule she planned, not through the hands she trusted, but it made it through because she had built it carefully enough that even 14 years of deliberate silence could not erase it, because she left a mark on a ring that only one person in the world knew how to read, because she ate lunch every Friday with a woman who remembered everything she ever said, because the truth she had built into the paperwork was stronger than the inaction placed on top of it. Some people don't steal money. They steal the years that money was supposed to save. But here is what they cannot steal, what no amount of silence or inaction or convenient forgetting can take from you: the fact that it was built. That someone sat at a table and did the math for you, specifically by name, and trusted the world to eventually get it to you. Cassidy knew. She did not need to be there when it arrived. She had already done her part. Love does not always announce itself. It does not always ask to be seen, or thanked, or even understood at the time. Sometimes it shows up in paperwork filed quietly on a teacher's salary, in $60 spent on a stranger's last beautiful thing, in a maker's mark stamped on the inside of a gold band, waiting 22 years to be read by the right pair of eyes. If someone built something for you in silence, if someone did the math right when you didn't know the numbers were being run, drop your city, your country in the comments below. Wherever you are watching from tonight, Ohio, Georgia, London, Lagos, Toronto, Kingston, Nairobi, Manila, Trinidad, South Africa, New York. We want to know you are there. We read every single one. If you know someone who needs to remember they were never as alone as they felt, send this to them today. Subscribe for more stories like this one. And when you're done, leave 3 words in the comments. She did the math right.